Be'ezrat Hashem, with Hashem's help, we begin another set of laws, the final set of laws actually in this book. Hilchos Shechitah, the laws of ritual slaughter. It's basically connected to the last set of laws, which is forbidden foods, because this book is called the book of Kedusha, the book of holiness. It's those subjects with which Hashem made us holy, separate from the other nations. The first one was who we marry, and the second one is what we eat. So we spent all this last 2.5 weeks essentially discussing which foods we're forbidden to eat, and now we're going to get into how to prepare permitted food. How to properly slaughter meat that we should be able to eat it. Yesh bichlalan, the Rambam always begins with a list of mitzvahs that he's going to discuss in these laws. Yesh bichlalan chamesh mitzvahs. In this set of laws, there are 5 mitzvahs being discussed. Shalish mitzvahs aseh, shtayim mitzvahs leis aseh, 3 positive mitzvahs, 2 negative ones. V'zehu pratan, these are their details. Aleph, lishchait va'achar kach yoichal. The first mitzvah is to slaughter and only then to eat. There's no mitzvah to actually go and slaughter an animal, but if you want to eat, you have to slaughter it first before you eat. It's like divorce, right? There's no mitzvah to get divorced, but if you want to get divorced, you have to do it a certain way. Same thing over here. If you want to slaughter, if you want to eat, you have to slaughter it a certain way. There's a special mitzvah not to slaughter a mother and an offspring on the same day. A mother cow, we'll see that a father,
it's a 7-day wait.
even though it says oisoi ve'es benoi, him, masculine, but it's a reference to the feminine, the mother. Gimel, lechasois dam chaya v'oif. When slaughtering a beast or a bird, a beast is like an undomesticated animal, like a deer, let's say, or a chicken, you have to cover the blood after the slaughtering. Dalid, shalei likach ha'eim al habanim. Literally, it means you don't take the mother together with her young. This is the mitzvah of shiluach hakan, sending away the mother bird. You don't take the mother with the young. Rather, hey, l'shaleach ha'eimim lekacha al habanim, you need to first send away the mother bird if you want to be able to take her with her young. In other words, you want to be able to take the eggs, you first send the mother away, or the chicks, and then you take the eggs or the chicks for yourself, and that's the mitzvah of shiluach hakan, as we're going to explore in the end of these laws. Ubir mitzvahs elu biprakim elu, the explanation of these 5 mitzvahs is coming in the next, actually 14 chapters. So we're going to be on this for 2 weeks, Be'ezrat Hashem, and that will conclude the 5th book of the Rambam. We begin Perek Rishon, chapter 1, all about Shechitah, ritual slaughter. It says the Rambam halacha aleph mitzvah saseh. It's a biblical positive commandment. Sheyishchait mi sheyirtze lechel besar behema chaya v'oif. Anybody who wants to eat the meat of a kosher domesticated animal, undomesticated animal, or bird, he needs to slaughter first. V'achar kach yoichal, and only then may he eat the meat. Shanemar, as it says, and this is the verse, the top verse on the screen. V'zavachta mi bekarcha u'mitzayncha. You must slaughter from your cattle and from your sheep. This is really talking about living far away from the temple, because we're going to see later on that originally, when the Jews were in the desert, you were not allowed to eat meat plain. Any meat you wanted to consume had to be brought as a korban, as a sacrifice. You bring it to the Mishkan, to the tabernacle, slaughter it, give parts of it to Hashem, and then parts you could take home for supper. But Hashem told the Jews in the Torah that it's going to come a time you're going to live in Israel, and you're going to live far from Jerusalem. You won't be able to every single time travel to Jerusalem to have dinner. So you're going to be allowed to slaughter your own animals in your own homes. V'nemar bivchar balmum, and then it says in the very next verse, concerning a firstborn animal that is blemished, firstborn animal has to be brought to the Kohen really as a sacrifice. But if it's blemished, you can keep it for yourself. It says, Ach ka'asher ye'ochel es hatzvi ve'es ha'ayel. Instead, the same way you eat a deer and a gazelle, you'll be able to eat the blemished firstborn. Instead of bringing it as a sacrifice, you can eat it as you eat a deer and a gazelle. Now, a deer and a gazelle are considered chayot. They're undomesticated animals. Halamadata, from this verse we learn, shechaya kibehema le'inyan shechita, that an undomesticated animal is like a domesticated animal when it comes to slaughter. But the same way you eat the deer and the gazelle, the same way you eat this animal, both have to have ritual slaughter. And about birds it says, Asher yatzud seid chaya oif v'goimer, anybody who traps an undomesticated animal or a bird, v'shafach es damoi, he needs to spill its blood first. In other words, ritually slaughter its blood, its life out of it, slaughter it in the kosher way, and only then, this teaches us, sheshvichas dam ha'oif keshvichas dam ha'chaya, that you spill the blood of the bird as you would spill the blood of the undomesticated animal, which we know is done in the regular way of Shechitah. So from here we see by a chain reaction that domesticated animals have to be slaughtered, undomesticated animals are like domesticated animals, and birds are like undomesticated animals, which means that at the end of the day, they all require this ritual slaughter. Halacha beis v'hilchos shechita bekulan achasein. The laws of ritual slaughter that apply to them all are all one. It's all the same laws applying to animals and birds. Lefichach, therefore, hashechit behema echaya oif. If somebody wants to slaughter a domesticated animal, undomesticated animal, or a bird, mevarich tchila, he first makes the blessing, asher kichanu b'mitzvaysa v'tzivanu ala shechita. Hashem has sanctified us with His mitzvahs and commanded us about the slaughtering. If you didn't make a bracha before slaughtering, bein b'shegig, bein b'mezid, whether you did it inadvertently or purposely, habasar mutar, whatever meat you're going to eat from this animal will be permitted. V'asar lechol min hashchuta kol zman she'im mifarkesas. It's forbidden to eat from the meat of the slaughtered animal so long as it's still convulsing. Because even after you slaughter it, it still makes some movements. While it's making those movements, in a way it's considered alive, you cannot eat from its meat. If you do eat from the animal before the soul fully leaves, you transgress a negative commandment. You're included in the verse that says, Lo soichlu al hadam. This verse says here in Vayikra, do not eat over the blood, which means don't eat from the animal while it's still expiring. However, you don't get lashes for this. Yeah. What you could do though is you can cut a piece of meat after the slaughtering before the soul expires, and then later eat it. Salt it very well, wash it very well, like we learned in the last set of laws. You have to salt meat before you eat it. Then wait for the animal to fully die, and then you can eat the meat. The point is you can't eat the meat while it's still convulsing, but after it convulses and it's dead, you can eat it. Gimel, this is all for animals and birds. Dogim, bachagavim, fish and locusts, einan tzrichin shechita. They don't have to be slaughtered. Ela asifasan hi amaterasaisan. Simply gathering them, collecting them, is what permits them to be eaten. Harehu Eimer. It says, this is an interesting verse, when the Jewish people asked for meat in the desert, they were tired of the man, they were tired of the bread from heaven, so they complained to Hashem. So Hashem said, I'm going to give you meat. So Moshe Rabbeinu wondered, he said, I don't understand. This is like the one time he asked a question of God. He said, Hatzoin uvakar yishachet lahem umatza lahem. Are you going to be able to slaughter enough sheep and cattle to provide for their needs? Imes kol degei hayam ye'asef lahem. Are you going to be able to gather, to collect all the fish of the sea, and it's going to provide for them? But notice the difference. When he was talking about sonu bakar, sheep and cattle, what's the word he uses? Yishachet, slaughter. When he's talking about the fish, what does he say? Ye'asef, gather. Which means asifas dagim kishchitas bakar vatzain. The collection, the gathering of the fish is equal to slaughtering for cattle and sheep. Uvachagavim nemar, about locusts, that also uses the same terminology. Oisef hechasil, the gathering of the locusts. Which means ba'asifa levada, simply collecting them is considered their slaughter. The fichach, therefore, says the Rambam, don't think it actually means you have to actively collect them. If they died, fish died, in the water on their own, mutarim, they're permitted. The point when we say gathering doesn't mean you have to actively gather. It means the way to eat them is simply pick them up. So if they dive in the water, you're good. You could even eat fish while they're alive, if you want. There's no mitzvah to kill them first and then to eat them. Now, halacha daled, if you noticed, the verse that the Rambam quoted for Shechitah, it just says v'zavachta, you should offer. It doesn't say any details about how to go about this ritual slaughter. So here is where we actually, one of the core places where we know that Jewish, to understand the written Torah, requires the oral Torah. Requires Torah Shebal Peh, the explanation of our sages. Because, says the Rambam, Zvicha zu ha'amura b'Torah stam, this slaughtering, which is stated in the Torah, with no definition, tzarich lefaresh oisa v'leida. It requires a lot of explanation and a lot of knowledge. Look how many questions one could have. First of all, at what place in the animal do you slaughter? Do you cut its back? Do you cut its foot? Where? Where do you cut the animal? Number two, the kama shir hashchita. How much is the requisite amount for slaughtering? Wherever you're going to cut, how much do you have to cut? What do you use to slaughter? What implement do you use to slaughter? Umasar shechatin, when can we slaughter during the day? The heichon shechatin, where can we slaughter? The ketzat shechatin, how do we go about the slaughtering? Umahin hadvarim hamafsidin es hashchita, what are things that may potentially destroy a slaughtering? Umihu hashechet, and who can slaughter? These are 8 questions. You see the word v'zavachta, you have 8 questions right away. And these 8 questions are all going to be answered in the next 4 chapters. All of these things were included in the commandment in the Torah when Hashem said, v'zavachta mi bekarcha, you shall slaughter from your cattle. How do we know how to slaughter? Look at the end of the verse. Ka'asher tzivisicha, as I commanded you. Now, nowhere in the written Torah does Hashem command us in the ways of slaughtering. This is one of the proofs that oral tradition came along with the written Torah. The way I commanded you means orally. That's how the achalta b'sharecha v'gomer. That's how you're going to eat meat in your gates. Meaning, shekol advarim ha'elu al pet tziva ben. Every one of these matters, Hashem commanded Moshe orally. Kishar Torah shebal peh, like any other parts of the oral Torah, shia nikras mitzvah, which is called by the name mitzvah. As we explained in the beginning of this compendium, in the introduction to the Rambam said that when Hashem says to Moshe Rabbeinu in the last week's parsha, actually, Mishpatim, I'm going to give you the Torah and the mitzvah. The Torah is the written Torah, the mitzvah is the oral Torah. So here where we have the word mitzvah, ka'asher tzivisicha, as I commanded you, it's a reference to that mitzvah, that oral tradition that was handed down from Hashem to Moshe Rabbeinu. So all of these 8 questions are going to be answered orally. So the Rambam begins to address each of these 8 questions. First of all, where on the animal? Makom hashchita min hachai hu hatzavar. The place of slaughter of the living animal is the neck. The neck means the front of the animal's neck. The chol hatzavar kosher l'shchita. The entirety of the neck is kosher for slaughtering. This, that a giraffe, we don't know where to slaughter it, is a myth. As a matter of fact, there's more room on the giraffe to slaughter, because you can slaughter anywhere on the neck area. There is an upper limit and a lower limit. We're going to discuss them in a second. But the point is you can slaughter anywhere on the neck. Let's take a cow, though, because this is the more common example. If you look at a cow, we're going to be discussing the 2 main pipes of the animal. This one here is the windpipe, the gray one on the bottom, and the pink one is the esophagus, the food pipe. So we're going to see that each of these has to be slaughtered, both of them. And there's going to be an upper limit and a lower limit to where you can slaughter these 2 pipes. So the Rambam begins with the esophagus. Ketzad baveshet. What does it mean that you can cut in the entirety of the neck? For the esophagus, mitchilas hamakim, from the beginning of the place, shekeshechoischin oisai, that when you cut into the food pipe, miskavets, it will contract. This is a picture that was drawn up in the Art Scroll Gemara, so I thank them very much. This is the food pipe. Up on the food pipe, higher up, if you were to cut into the food pipe, the hole will actually widen. A little lower down, the hole will stay as it is. A little lower down, when you cut into it, it will actually fold in. This is the beginning point on the veshet, on the esophagus, where you're allowed to slaughter. The top. And then you can go down along the esophagus anywhere, ad makom sheyasir, until the place where it begins to get hairy. The yaschel liyos pratzin kekaris, and it becomes indents, like the rumen. This is called papillae. If you're a little familiar with animal anatomy, at the bottom of the esophagus, as it gets, let's use this picture actually. Here's the esophagus. Okay, follow the pink. As it gets closer to the stomach, in order for the animal's digestive system to work properly, at the end of the esophagus, just before it begins going into the kares, into the rumen, the inside, the lining of the esophagus becomes somewhat hairy. The Talmud calls it hairy. The Rambam calls it hairy. In English, it's called papillae. That's this little stuff here. This is the inside lining of the veshet. So all the way till there. So while we think of, let's say you think of slaughtering the animal over here, which is usually the typical place, technically somehow, if you can cut into the animal all the way over here and reach the esophagus here, it would be a kosher shechita. But if you were looking at the giraffe, let's say, if you're looking at the giraffe, that might be a little more reasonable to understand, because the esophagus will go all the way down this pipe over here, all the way till about here. So you could cut into the giraffe either at the bottom of the neck, top of the neck, middle, wherever it is. The point is, for the veshet, that's the extent. From the beginning, that point where it will contract if you cut it, all the way down to the beginning of the stomach where it begins to get hairy. Zehu makom hashchita baveshet. That's the place of slaughtering on the food pipe. Shachat l'mayla mimakom zeh. If you were to slaughter higher up than this place, halachavav, v'hu hanikra tarbat haveshet, which is called literally the courtyard or the entrance to the food pipe. You can see it over here. This is the beginning of the food pipe, and the tarbat haveshet is this area. You see, I don't know if can you see the line? This little square here. This area right over here. That's the courtyard of the veshet, the entrance to the food pipe, non-kosher. Or lower down than this place. In other words, lower down than the edge of where the papillae starts. Which is essentially the beginning of the intestines. Shechitah psula, your slaughtering will be invalidated, it will be disqualified. The amount, how large, what is the space of this courtyard entrance to the food pipe, where you cannot slaughter? For an undomesticated animal, it's the space of 2 fingers. If you were to grab onto the top of the animal's neck, 2 finger breadths, this area here, that's the tarbat haveshet, that's the beginning of the esophagus where you cannot slaughter. For a bird, it's different. It goes according to the size of the bird. That's how much the entrance to the gullet that you cannot slaughter. And to the bottom, it goes all the way to the crop. Here's a chicken. You can see the food pipe, the back over here. This is the zefek, this is the crop. So you can only slaughter from up top over here till where the crop begins. So you have kind of much less, if you think about it, much less space to slaughter, but it's ample enough. If you go to Kaparot before Yom Kippur, you give them the chicken, you'll see where they slaughter it. It's right over there, in between this spot here. That is as far as the food pipe. Now, the Ezehu Makim Shechitah Bakana. What's the area of the slaughtering in the windpipe, in the trachea? So, let's look back over here. You can see this is the windpipe, and we're going to explore this more in chapter 3 at length, but you can see how the windpipe is made up of a bunch of rings. It's a series of rings.
Even in human, it's the same thing.
Huh? Human, the same thing?
Yeah.
A series of rings?
You can feel it right here.
That's why you feel it's bumpy?
Muscles.
Ah. Okay, yeah. The different muscles, exactly. So it goes like this. Mishipui koiva ulamata, from the slant of the cap and lower down. Again, we're going to explore this more in chapter 3, but at the top of the windpipe, there's what's called the cricoid cartilage. Okay, it's kind of somewhat of a covering over the pipe that is slanted. It's also called in the Gemara the tabas hagdola, the large ring. It's towards the top of the windpipe here, somewhat of a covering again, and it's slanted. So the sages called it the shipui koiva, the slanted cap. Anywhere from there, going down, ad roish knaf hareya, until the beginning of the lobe of the lung, when an animal will stretch forth its neck to pasture. So maybe you can see a little clearer over here on this side. See there? The point where the trachea enters the lung, that's down here. However, the kanfeireya, the lobes or the wings of the lung, is over here. So technically, the place of shechita ends here. But when the animal stretches its neck forth, a little bit of this part will be pulled outwards. Like when you put your neck forth, a little part of the pipes here will come a little bit forth. So to the animal's pipes come a little bit forth when they pasture. So that's it. Zehu makim hashchita bakana. That's the spot of slaughtering on the windpipe. So going back to the animal, any part outside of the animal that corresponds to this area, from up here to the lungs, from up here to the intestines, that's called nikrat savar. That's called in Torah the front of the neck. The front of the neck is that area which corresponds to the kosher place of shechita. Halacha ches ansa habehema atzma umashcha tzavara harbe. If the animal forced itself forward and pulled out its neck much further, such that a part of the windpipe, which is usually hidden in the lungs, now came further out, or the slaughterer wasn't so nice to the animal, and he pulled forth the pipes, umashchan lemaila, pulled them upward, v'shachad b'makim shchita batzavar. Technically speaking, he slaughtered in the neck area. In other words, when his knife entered the animal's skin, it entered it at a point that would be called the halachic neck, but the point where it met the pipes was a point that shouldn't be exposed to that. The slaughtering, as it relates to the actual pipes, weren't in the spot of the shechita because he pulled it upwards. Now it's a doubt whether this is a dead meat, whether it's not properly slaughtered. Because while you put your knife into the animal at the proper point, it didn't reach the pipes at the proper point. The slaughterer must slaughter at the midpoint of the neck. Let's use the giraffe again as our example. While this is the neck, you have to cut in from the front. You cannot cut in from the side.
Right here.
Yes, right there. If you did slaughter from the sides, it's a kosher shechita. But ideally, you come in right from the middle. So that answers the placement of the shechita. Right? The first question of the 8 questions was, where on the animal do we slaughter? We have the answer to that question. The next question is, v'kama hu shir hashchita. How much must be slaughtered? We know that both the windpipe and the food pipe have to be reached, but how much? Says the Rambam, shnei ha-simonim, shehein hakana v'haveshet, both signs, simonim is signs, the reason why the pipes are called signs, because they're the signs of a kosher shechita. So both pipes have to be cut, the windpipe and the food pipe. Hashchita ha-ma'ula sheyichatchu shneim. The most ideal, the best shechita is that both of them should be cut, bein bebehema, bein ba'oif, both in an animal or in a bird. V'lazeh yiskavin hashaychet. That's what the slaughterer should be looking for. He should be aiming to cut them both. Let me show you. This is a cutaway view of an animal's neck, so you can appreciate what's kind of like the size. Look at the ratio here. This big circle is the windpipe. This small little narrow thing is the food pipe. So the breathing pipe is actually much larger, and the food pipe is located to the right, because this is the animal's front. Understand? If you're looking at the animal's head, this is what you would see if you cut away the head. So the shechita will go in from the bottom of the animal, and cut through all the way to here. So it passes both the windpipe and the food pipe. That's the ideal shechita. But if all you were able to do was slaughter most of one of the signs in a bird, or most of the 2 signs in an animal, it's a kosher slaughtering, So at least the majority of both for an animal, the majority of one for a bird. What if you slaughtered one of the complete pipes and the second one only halfway through? For an animal, that would be a disqualified shechita, because you have to have the majority of both. Here, while you have a complete one, you don't have a majority of the second one. If you slaughtered a majority of both, even though you crossed the halfway threshold just by a hair's breadth, tiny bit, it's a kosher slaughtering. You did most of the pipes. Once you slaughtered more than half, even the smallest amount, that's considered the majority and you're good. If you slaughtered exactly halfway through both of the pipes, even for a bird it would be disqualified, because for a bird you need a majority of one, and here you have a majority of none. What if an animal in its lifetime, its windpipe was halfway cut? It was slit. Something happened to it, it got a cut. And you, the slaughterer, knew that somehow, and you slaughtered over the cut exactly, and a tiny bit more, making it a majority. So in practicality, you only slaughtered a tiny amount, but because it was already halfway cut, you made it a majority cut. Whether you began to slaughter at a point where the windpipe was still whole, and you met the cut, or you were expert, you put your knife into the cut, and then you just completed it to the majority, the slaughtering is kosher. Because bottom line is, a majority of the pipe is cut. Halacha Yud Beis kol hashoichet. Every slaughterer, he needs to check the pipes after slaughtering. He needs to see, did he cut enough? If he didn't check it, and then the entirety of the head was severed before he could check. So he doesn't know how much was slaughtered in the moment of slaughtering. Now the butcher's cut it all off, but he doesn't know how much he cut. The animal is assumed to be nevela, non-kosher. Even if the slaughterer was expert and quick, doesn't matter, because you have to check these signs. Yud Gimel, the Rambam gives basically the reason for what he just said. Every animal in its lifetime is presumed to be forbidden. Ad sheyivada bevadai shenishchata shchita ksheira, till you know for sure that it was slaughtered with a kosher slaughtering. So as long as you can't say for sure, I slaughtered it fully kosher, you can't consider it to be fully kosher. Therefore, in this case where he didn't check the signs, it's not kosher. So we answer the second question, how much has to be slaughtered? Now we're on to the third question. Yudaledu be'ezeh davar shechatin. With which implement? What do we use to slaughter? Bechol davar, anything sharp. Bein besakin shel mateches, bein betzer, whether it's a metal knife, or a stone, a sharp stone, oy bischuchis, or a glass, oy bikrumis shel knei ha'agam, or the sharp edge of a reed that grows in a swamp. V'chayetze behen midvarim ha'chayischim, anything similar, an implement which cuts. But the edge has to be sharp, with no bumps, no spikes, no dents. But if on the sharp edge there was some kind of little barb, a little bump, or a little indent, even if it was very small, the whole slaughtering is invalidated. It has to go smooth and quick. If the spike or the barb could only be felt from one way, from one side, in other words, if you rubbed your thumb along the knife this way, you would feel the bump. But this way, you won't feel the bump. Lo yishchad ba. Ideally, you shouldn't use this knife. V'imshacha derech haruach she'ena pegima nikeres ba shchitah ksheira. But if you slaughtered only in the direction which the bump would not be felt, then it's kosher. We're going to again see ideally that when you slaughter, you have to make both a forward and a backward motion. The knife has to go both ways. But let's say it's a chicken, it's a very thin neck, and you're able with just one forward motion to cut the neck. So then, if your knife's bump can only be felt in the backward motion, and you do just a forward thrust and slaughter it, it's kosher. Ketzad, what would that look like? Here he goes. If a knife would be checked in a forward motion, you would not feel that it has a bump. When you bring your fingers back, you do feel the bump. If you slaughtered only by a forward motion, you didn't bring it back, slaughtering is kosher. But if you did bring it back, that means the animal felt the bump, that means it's disqualified shechita. A knife whose blade goes up and down like a snake, but there is no bump. For example, this. Okay? This is a blade. It's a spiral, kind of a spiraling blade. If you roll your thumb against the edge of the entire line of the blade, you'll never feel a bump. It's totally smooth. The shape happens to be bumpy, but it itself is not bumpy. Says the Rambam, Shechatin balechatchila. It's kosher to use even initially. Totally kosher knife. What if a knife's blade is smooth but not sharp? It's a dull knife, but no bumps. As long as there's no bumps, you can slaughter with it. It'll take a long time. It may take you going backwards and forwards all day until you slaughter the animal, but still shchitah ksheira. It's a kosher shchita because the bottom line is there was no bumps.
I understand that the shchita used to be very swift.
It still is.
And here it says...
Well, there's a case that it could happen. The point is that it would still be kosher. So if you come to the rabbi after the fact and you give him this knife and he says, it wasn't sharp, it's still okay. Of course, we try our best to make our knives as sharp as possible, super, super sharp. The animal doesn't, in a blink of an eye, it's dead. It doesn't even feel what's going on. Yudches sakin chada shehush chaza. A sharp knife which was so sharpened. Where's my sharpening picture over here? This is an actual sharpening stone. Yeah, this is a huge knife. And he sharpens the knife, okay? But the blade now is not smooth. Touching it is like touching the top of an ear of grain, where it just becomes like what's called snarled in your finger. It just like kind of goes in. Understand?
Presses down.
Yes, it doesn't go, it's not able to properly cut now. Nevertheless, since there's no indents or bumps in it, you can slaughter with it. If somebody picks out a reed or a tooth, or he cuts off a piece of stone or a nail, and the cutting edge is sharp with no bumps, you can slaughter with them. But if you stuck it into the ground, so you got a big sharp stone, stuck it in the ground, and then you bring an animal up against it, and slaughter against the stone, lo yishchit bahen k'shehei ne'utzin. You cannot slaughter with them as they're stuck into the ground. It has to be detached from the ground. V'im shachat shchita seksheda. After the fact, if you did it, it's still kosher. Chav shachat bahen k'shehei mechubarin b'tchilas briyasan. If you slaughter with these, let's say, reeds or nails, the way they were created, attached to their sores, kaidem sheyaker reisan, before you detach them, shchita psula. Then it's disqualified. Shechitah v'afal pi she'ein b'hen pegam, even if it's totally kosher, there's a reed growing from the ground. It's fully sharp, but it hasn't been detached yet. You cannot bring an animal up against it and slaughter. It's disqualified. What if lokach lechi behema sheyesh by shinayim chadais v'shachat b'hen? What if you took a full jaw of an animal? It had a tooth. Okay, this is a live animal, but look at this tooth coming out of the jaw. This could be pretty sharp. So imagine this animal was dead, and you took the whole head of the animal with the tooth in the jaw, and you slaughtered with it. Shchitasei psula, says the Rambam. It's disqualified. If there's a bunch of teeth. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. If there's a bunch of teeth. Because the bunch of teeth together are like a sickle, which is very bumpy. Here's the case. If it's one tooth stuck into the jaw, you can slaughter with it initially, even if it's set into the jaw, because the whole jaw has been detached, it's dead from the original animal. If you heated up a knife in fire, you made it white hot, and you slaughtered with it, it's still a kosher shechita. We don't say that it's going to be the heat slaughtering it. It still goes by the knife, and the animal will be slaughtered. If you have a knife which has a double-edged blade, one blade is bumpy like a sickle, the other is smooth. Initially, you shouldn't use even the smooth side. For a decree that maybe you're going to slaughter on the other side. But if you did slaughter it, since the bottom line is you use the smooth side, the shechita is kosher. Every slaughterer needs to check his knife before he uses it, both on the blade, on the edge of the blade, and each side, to see that it kind of comes down smoothly. The ketzad baidka, what's the way to check it? Got to take a little risk. You got to bring the knife back and forth against the flesh of your skin, of your finger. And also bring it back and forth on your nail. From all three edges, the bottom of the blade and the two sides. To make sure that there's no bump at all. And then you can slaughter with it. And you have to also check after the slaughtering. Because if you find a bump after the slaughtering, the whole animal becomes in doubt. Maybe it's a nevela. Maybe when you were bringing the knife in through the skin, before it reached the pipes. Here's the picture. Right? There's some space there. But from the skin before you reach the pipes, maybe in the skin it got a bump, got a nick. And by the time you reach the actual signs, the pipes, when you slaughter them, you were slaughtering with a bumpy knife. Therefore, if you're an industrial slaughterer and you're slaughtering many animals, many birds, according to the Rambam, you have to check in between each one. Because if you don't check, and you check at the end of the process and now you find a bumpy knife, all the animals are in question. All of them are doubtful nevelas, even the first one. Because again, maybe even in the first one, and you can't eat it. Maybe even the first one was in the skin, it got a bump. Today, I'm actually not familiar. Maybe I should have asked someone who does the shechitah, but I believe that in the highest quality places, they do check between each animal, even though it costs a lot of time. But in other, let's say, other places, they will slaughter a bunch of animals at a time.
I think that they have laser now.
Huh?
Laser.
No, you have to have a physical checker. But what they'll do is, they'll check every couple of animals, and as the animals go onto the assembly line, they will divide the animal parts by color. So you have one cow goes through, this cow is the red cow. All of its parts are marked with red. If after 5-6 cows, the shochet discovers that his knife had a bump, so the last couple of cows go off the assembly line, all the ones that are marked with that color go off the assembly line, understand? So there's both risk and reward because you save time, but you could end up losing more animals. I believe that's how it's done, but I will check with the shochet and I'll get back to you tomorrow. I'll let you know the final facts. You checked the knife before you slaughtered, and you slaughtered. V'loi badka achar shechita, you did not check it after the slaughtering. But v'shavar ba'etzem ma'etz v'chayetze b'hen. You also use this knife after the slaughtering to break a bone or to break a piece of wood. V'achar kach badak u'mitzah paguma, and afterwards you check and you find it to be blemished, bumpy. Shechitah ksheda, retroactively we can say the slaughtering was kosher. Because in this case, since you know you broke a knife or a wood or a bone with it, probably that's where the bump came from. Or if you were just negligent and you didn't check the knife. Actually, like, or you lost the knife, you can't check it anymore. After the fact, we say it's kosher. Any butcher who didn't have his knife checked in front of a wise man, a Torah sage, and he slaughtered on his own authority, we have a rabbi come in and check the knife. If we find the knife to be smooth and fully kosher, we still put him in excommunication. We're worried he's going to rely on himself another time, and it's going to be bumpy, and he's going to slaughter it, it's going to be a problem. But can you imagine if he slaughtered on his own and we found it to be bumpy? So we fire him. We fire him from his position. And we excommunicate him. We make a public announcement that any meat that he slaughtered is treif, because he didn't have a rabbi come in and check. Now today, it's since Shechitah is so industrialized, it's really, really hard to have a rabbi come and check every single slaughtherer's knife. So what we do is, they slaughter in pairs. Shochatim stand in groups of 2, and they each check each other's knives. So each one serves as a rabbi for each other. And once every couple of months, the major supervising rabbi comes in and checks all the knives. So at least you have that element. But during the slaughtering, they check each other's knives. Chav Zayin, kama hu oirech hasakin sheshechet. How long must the knife be that you use for slaughtering? Kol shehu. It could be any length. V'hu shelo yiyeh davar dak shenoikev ve'ein shechet. But it cannot be pointed, thin, that it just pokes into the animal without slaughtering it. Like the edge of a small knife, something like that. It's got to be large enough. I think today the accepted practice is that it should be double the size of the neck of whatever animal you're slaughtering.
The chicken's going to be small.
Chicken's going to be small. Animals got to be big. My great-grandfather was a shochet. He had these massive animal knives. Because there has to be room to go forward and backward, ideally. So it has to be double the size of the neck. Chav Ches, the fourth of the 8 questions. Umasai shechatin. When do we slaughter? B'chol zman. You may not think this, but actually you can slaughter any time. Bein bayoim, bein balayla, whether by day or by night. V'hu shetiya avuka imay. If you're slaughtering by night, you have to have light. You have to have a torch. Kadei sheyireh mayasa, so you can see what you're doing. Huh? No. If you slaughtered in the nighttime, shechitah ksheda, the slaughtering is kosher, even if it's totally dark and there's no light, it's okay. Chavtes. If you slaughter on Yom Kippur or on Shabbos inadvertently, when it's forbidden to slaughter, but you did it by mistake, you weren't aware that it was Yom Kippur or Shabbos, or you weren't aware that it's forbidden to slaughter on Yom Kippur or Shabbos, afal pi, it could be, afal pi she'ilu haya mezid, even though had you done it purposely, haya mischayev benafsha, haya mischayev malchus Yom Kippurim, you'd either be liable to the death penalty on Shabbos or to lashes on Yom Kippur. Bottom line is, you did it by mistake, shechitah ksheda, your slaughtering is a kosher slaughtering, and you can eat from that meat.